Welcome to the next episode of Association Peeps in Cubicles Drinking Coffee. I'm Jillian. Today we're here with Bennett, and our coffee of the day is the Costco 120 K-Cup pack, and we make our Costco runs weekly here at Partners. Today we're going to be talking about managing associations and their finances through a crisis.
Great. Thanks, Jillian. It's great to be here and appreciate you bringing this great topic for all of us. So I'm just going to maybe set one data point, and then obviously there's a lot to talk about within this. But I mean, I think the premise that you painted for associations as far as kind of the budget size and things like that, I mean, the reality is, if we look at a lot of the nonprofit research out there, the majority of associations really don't have much in reserves. There are some outliers, obviously, but it's about 25% of associations have 6 or more months in reserve, which means the majority of the organizations that we all work in or work with really don't have much of a lifeline. So this is a very crucial topic for all of us. So thanks for bringing it up.
So what do you think that association executives and their board of directors should be looking for when they're looking at their budgets with their associations who don't have large reserves?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first starting point is to look at how we've done it in the past, and then what do we have to do differently. So I mean, I think all of us just in a general sense took the premise that we would take 3 to 5 years of historical trends and then come out with averages, and then you look at any kind of program or service changes and then make those accommodations. And those cycles can change, but in those cases you're generally in control of the cycle. In the COVID-19 and things like that, that type of environment we're all in, we're out of control in terms of a lot of the factors. So I think the issue comes down to play is, do you come up with a plan where you've got maybe more than one budget based on different types of contingencies, and then also the window, if you will, of what is your projection in terms of contingency planning for either using reserves if you have them and or building up additional reserves. When we would go forward, the golden rule was you have at least 1 year of operating expense in reserve. Well, now we kind of know that may not even be close to enough given, COVID-19 kind of factors, because we don't know kind of the tail of this in terms of how long it will impact all of us in terms of disruption in meeting revenue or membership revenue or other program areas. So I think all the things that we, have historically used as tools, the tools are still relevant, but we just have to add a lot more to the equation to get it right.
So what do you think the number one tool is that they should start with?
I mean, data's always been the king. It still is. It's just, I think, the amount of data and what type of data, you are working with your boards, your budget and finance committees. I think that's extremely important. I think certainly just in terms of the process, doing more survey research to your contingencies and your constituents, whether it's exhibitors, sponsors, magazine advertisers, whether it's print or digital, certainly your membership base, any other area where you're bringing in revenue of some nature is, don't take historical averages and build on that, and don't make assumptions, go out real time and kind of get a pulse from each of those target markets and then really determine what their potential buying habits are going to be or what they think it's going to be, and then kind of build around that. So
what I'm hearing is that these associations and their leaders and their boards should try to make adjustments early.
Yeah, and I think make adjustments early because waiting is not good, because cash will burn if you're not paying attention. And I think the other part is just, again, being adaptable, that probably every month, every quarter, you're probably going to be looking at the numbers and reevaluating and pivoting, if you will, either up or down, and taking in new factors into consideration and helping to kind of get to the other side.
Okay, Bennett, so a crisis hits. What's the first tool that you go to in managing your association's finances? Sure,
it's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things we did at Partners is all the different client organizations, which, some had sizable reserves, which, was great, but many of our groups were more like the norm that I talked about earlier, that, had either some reserves or very low reserves, which are only going to last for a very short amount of time. So I think the first thing is doing a kind of some quick and dirty ratios of terms of assets to expenses and kind of look at, okay, like, and realistically, based on where we are now, what's our window of time? And that gives you kind of your idea of how quickly you need to act and how significantly you may need to do some either budget constriction on expenses, or looking at revenue generation in other areas. So if you build into that equation, then you get into the cash flow management discussion, and then that encompasses several things. So cash flow management in the sense of doing monthly cash flow projections based on what you believe to be reality on the expense and revenue side. And obviously you may want to have, again, more than one option to look at from a cash flow as things change in terms of going forward. As part of the expense side, I mean, certainly a lot of organizations, in some cases they were forced to make some very significant decisions, whether it was, workforce constriction, cut benefits, whatever it may be, which are very significant upheaval. But ideally, hopefully you can buy time where you don't have to do that. So the only way to do that is look across the board, look at your vendor relationships. Are there, additional terms that you've been able to glean in terms of payment time frames? Are there, if you didn't have a line of credit at a bank, is that something to consider? Certainly things like the EIDL loan from SBA, whatever it may be, all those things could come into play in terms of your cash flow management and the outcomes, if you will. It's all about buying time, and each group has X amount of time. There's no, even in good times, there's no such thing as guaranteed revenue. In many cases, there is a thing called guaranteed expense because there's a contractual obligation, and that's the issue of then you go to your terms and say, can we renegotiate either the terms, whether that's the actual fee structure, or at least the payment terms where you're saying, hey, we can pay you, but we need 90 days instead of net 30. But you got to look at every line item, very closely to kind of start to get some of those answers, and then you build your cash flow projections around that.
So generally in a crisis, people can panic and they could fire sale everything off. What is your recommendation to them if they do panic?
Yeah, I think a little bit of panic is good, because if they're not paying attention, then there's something wrong too. But fear and panic doesn't usually lead to good decision making. So to your point, I think if you look at, it's just like we do any kind of strategic planning, but this obviously is focused on financial management, is look at the things that bring high value, either in terms of either revenue or value proposition to members or prospects, things that are low value, but maybe are just underutilized, those kind of things, and then determine are there areas, untapped potential for new revenue streams given the new dynamics, and then figure out, is there an ability, although money's tight given the situation, is there an ability to put some marketing or reallocate marketing expenses to something else that's maybe now in this situation is going to drive revenue, as opposed to something that based on things out of your control that are not drawing or generating the kind of revenue you're used to, and taking all those kind of questions into consideration before you make any what I would call hasty decisions. You got to obviously look at the big picture, peel the onion back, and then really ask some, I'd say 3 or 4 key questions in each program area, and then build on that, and that at least gives you a starting point to work from.
So the groups who do have maybe a small amount in reserve, is it your recommendation that they pull all of that into their operating funds or draw at it slowly if needed?
I've been using the term toolkit in a lot of different ways for different topics related to COVID-19, and in this case, toolkit is, consultants. So getting your banker involved, your CPA involved. If you've got a financial advisor, obviously if you've got reserves, they need to be involved in that conversation. So, your I guess I'd say the base of people you're having conversations with as it relates to financial, objectives is much broader than probably what we're accustomed to doing in budget planning processes. And so I think making sure that the table has the right people beyond just yourself and maybe the board volunteers that are either executive committee or the board as a whole, budget, finance, add other people to the conversation, just so you're not leaving some type of avenue for, increasing your probability for success, out of consideration. So, getting the CPA, the bankers involved, whatever it may be, is looking at obviously, congressional action as it relates to nonprofit or even local, avenues for financial assistance, whether it's grants or loans or, things of that nature. everything should be on the table, and then you have to determine which ones are right. But to your question, I think I would say certainly even in good times, spending down to your last dollar of reserves is probably never a good idea, because the ability to build it back up is just not very high, even in good times. And now it's clearly not. So I think reserves doesn't mean that you shouldn't tap into them. This is definitely the rainy day when you tap into the reserves. But I think you also have to recognize, okay, we're going to get through this. We're going to get to the other side. We still want reserves for later to invest in new programs and services when we need and want to be able to do that. And if that money's gone, then all you've done is, you're going to hit the wall. It's just going to do it in a different time frame, but still be in the same position later if you haven't utilized all the other avenues to bring in some potential cash to help, get to the other side.
Is there a way for associations to continue to contribute to their reserves during this time?
I think certainly, depending on what the membership constituency is, some sectors are growing in COVID-19, given what they do, from an industry or professional standpoint. Obviously, most are not doing really well. But the reality of the situation is, the value of associations, I think most members and even non-members have a much clearer vision of what associations can bring in terms of benefit for them. And so even though their money is probably tight from a professional or business standpoint, they may say, hey, it's to my best interest long-term and short-term to have the association still be here, to kind of be the beacon of hope and, bringing good content. So there may be, even if it's small amounts of money, potentially the ability to generate some non-dues revenue from a contribution standpoint to help that cause. And you could potentially couch it as that and promote it as that. And I think they'll understand that as long as your organization's been delivering good content when they really needed it, which most groups have, I think that is an avenue to look at as part of the consideration of where can we generate some revenue where we traditionally don't.
So it sounds like a lot of it comes down to relationships. The relationships that you have with the personnel at the bank, with your CPA, with your financial advisors, who can advise you what best path to take if you need to draw from your reserves, but they can also advise you on what best path to take in order to contribute to those reserves and where that money could be best utilized.
Yeah, I think the reality is, you only know what you know, and if you're looking just down and looking within your four walls, that's your sphere of perspective, and so get some other people's perspective in the mix in terms of other customers or clients that they're serving, so they can say, hey, I've got another group. Obviously, I'm not going to mention names because of privacy, but they can say, hey, I've got another group organization that's kind of gone through something similar. Here's what they did. Here's how they did it. Here's what the process looked like. So, time is of the essence, and so this is not the time for trial and error. So you're having vulnerability to ask for help. It's a good thing to do. That's what they're there for, and so use them when you need them. And so I think that would help. And then they're going to bring either kind of, I'd say, processes or timelines to consider, but also as things change, either state relief or federal relief that continues throughout this process and this pandemic, that there may be things that you haven't considered because the rules keep changing, but now actually apply and make you eligible for something that you maybe not be eligible before.
This is all really great information, Bennett. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Jillian. It's been a pleasure. Yeah.
If you're interested in some of the tools that Bennett spoke about today, you can go to wallacefoundation.org. They have a great list of resources to help you and your association manage your finances on a day-to-day basis and through a crisis. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.